Alright guys, so welcome to the Biomechanics segment of this resource hub. What we're going to do is basically go over all the key foundational principles to help you gain a basic understanding of biomechanics. Now, you don't need a PhD in this sort of stuff, although I would probably say that there's just several topics that I think as people who want to take lifting in the gym seriously, we need to understand a little bit about physics, how this applies to applying forces to the body and ultimately producing results. So how does this work? So segment number one, or video number one, we are going to go over all of the various kinds of forces and talk a little bit about real life situations in which these apply. So the first force we want to talk about, well really it'll come over here, is gravity. So I know that that one's obvious, but we have to understand that weights alone don't weigh anything without gravity, okay? Objects have mass, that's the technical word for it, and mass is moved in a certain direction based on some sort of external force. In most cases, or at least in the case of free weights like dumbbells and barbells, we're looking at gravity. So obviously, gravity is pulling the dumbbell down that way. That would be the line of force. The force is pulling it in that direction, okay? So that's number one. Now we've got other forces as well. Now, if you remember all the way back in school, you might have gone over the topic of Isaac Newton's 3 laws of physics. One of which being quite famous, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So we have to understand that every object, whether it's a dumbbell, a piece of equipment, a bench, even the ground, everything is pushing back on us when we're pushing on it, relative to the mass of the object. So when we're standing on the earth is actually pushing back up against us relative to the mass of the earth. When we are gripping a dumbbell, the dumbbell is also producing force against our hand relative to the mass of the dumbbell. So that's how that works. Everything that we come into contact to, human beings included, want to essentially exert a force back upon us, equal and opposite to the force that we apply to it. It's the reason that when we spring on the ground when we're running, then the ground pushes us back and we can propel ourselves even further into the air and ultimately move forwards. So how this applies to your lifting, because this is actually important, and I am actually going somewhere with this, is say for example you're taking someone on a bench press. I'll move Sam out the way, you get out of the way. So someone on a bench press, their feet, the floor is pushing back up on their foot, okay? The bench right here, that's pushing back up against your hips. Now that's why it's important, for example, on a bench press to actually push down into the ground, because yes, we all are aware that that creates stability, but the reason it creates stability is actually because the earth is pushing back up on us. That's the important thing to understand. Same with the bench, if we can dig our glutes tighter into the bench will push back up on us, and therefore that's more force to essentially be transferred, hopefully, into the rep. That's the same with our back, and part of the reason that when we retract our shoulder blades, we create we create a wider surface to press down against the bench with. We want to create tension in our back, because ultimately that's going to push down harder into the bench, and the bench is going to push back harder onto us, and that's what's going to make us stronger. So that's another force. Now another one to talk about is friction force. Now say for example I am pushing into my foot, but in a sort of sliding manner, like this against the ground. Then the ground is not just pushing back up against us, but it's also, if I'm pushing my foot that way, then the ground is pushing my foot backwards as a sort of sliding force as well. Now, those are all the sort of external forces that I want to talk about. We also have internal forces as well. So say, for example, the force that's required to lift a dumbbell when you're doing a lat raise. There's a force that produced from our shoulder that's obviously lifting the dumbbell up. But then also, as the dumbbell starts to descend back to the ground, so we've got to obviously apply the force internally from the muscle to get the weight up, we've also got to have resisting forces on the way down as well. So all of these forces come together to play a role in how we should look at exercises, and ultimately the important thing to grasp here is this will dictate where an exercise is most challenging. And oftentimes when we're looking at training programming and things like that, we might want to challenge specific lengths of a certain muscle. You know, for example, if you have a dumbbell lateral raise, a lot of people know that the hardest part is at the top, right? Because gravity is pulling the weight down, very simple to understand that one. This is the position where your shoulder is contracted. It's in the concentric portion of the contraction. It's in the shorten range. Now, if we wanted to challenge that muscle in the lengthen range, which is typically shown to be a bit more effective for muscle growth, then we need to understand which movements apply the most amount of tension in that range relative to the forces that are going on, and how can we manipulate our technique in order to achieve a certain result. So this is a basic introduction to forces, how this all works. Now, the next part of this conversation really is to talk about the lines of force, okay? So lines of force, very, very simple. This would be the dumbbell being pulled to the ground in this direction by gravity, okay? I would also say the bench press, you've got your hand there. You've got your hand right there. This will be the line of force because you're pressing up, but then the bar is also down like that, okay? So it's also important to understand the lines of force, as in where the weight is going and where it would go if you let go of it and things like that. This does get a little bit more complex when we're working with machines, because machines have loads of different components to the machines, lots of different lever arms that rotate around different axes and have a slightly different, more of a curved line of force, and that can influence things. But that's getting into the weeds a little bit. You just need to grasp a basic understanding of the different forces that are going on, why they matter in training, why they create stability, but then also the lines of force as well, because the next conversation we're going to have is about moment arm and how that influences the point throughout a rep where the tension is the greatest. So you can look at exercises in a little bit of a different manner. So hopefully this makes sense. I'll see you in the next one.